The moment my boss called me replaceable, somebody near the back of the conference room actually laughed, and I still remember how the sound echoed against the glass walls on the 14th floor while 50 employees sat frozen around the quarterly review tables pretending not to look at me. It was Monday, March 3, 2025, 9:12 a.m., and I was standing beside a projection screen holding a printed operations report I had worked on until almost midnight the night before when Daniel Mercer leaned back in his chair, loosened his tie, and told the room, "This company survives because people learn to adapt, not because one employee thinks she's indispensable," before glancing directly at me while the HR director stared at her laptop to avoid eye contact. And what made it worse wasn't even the insult. It was the fact that 3 of the efficiency systems he was presenting as his own had come directly from my reports, including the vendor restructuring proposal that saved the company $1.80 million the previous quarter. I remember gripping the edge of the folder hard enough to leave nail marks in the paper while my inbox buzzed with Slack notifications from coworkers saying, "Are you okay?" and "Don't react." But the truth is, I stopped hearing the room after Daniel smiled and said, "Some people here should remember they can be replaced by Friday," because he thought humiliation would make me small, and what he didn't know was that by the time he finished speaking, I had already decided I was done protecting him. I had worked at Halbrecht Consulting Group for 4 years, and by the spring of 2025, I knew the company better than most executives did because I was the person fixing problems nobody else wanted attached to their name. I handled vendor escalations, payroll emergencies, staffing gaps, client retention reports, and the quiet disasters that happened after executives went home. Yet somehow Daniel Mercer still managed to present himself as the architect of every success. During board reviews while positioning me as support staff whenever promotion season came around, and I should have understood something was wrong back in January after HR accidentally copied me on an internal email chain discussing leadership optics, where Daniel argued that I lacked executive presence despite assigning me to train 2 newly hired senior managers making nearly $40,000 more than I was. Still, I stayed quiet because I believed performance would eventually matter more than politics until the Thursday before the meeting when Daniel forwarded me an expense audit at 11:47 p.m. marked urgent, and demanded I rebuild 3 months of reporting errors before Monday's executive review even though the discrepancies were tied to accounts only he approved, and somewhere between cross-checking reimbursement receipts from a client dinner in Miami and noticing duplicated contractor invoices totaling $214,000, I realized the numbers around Daniel's department weren't just careless, they were dangerous. But I didn't say anything yet because powerful men rarely destroy themselves all at once. Usually, they do it slowly enough for someone patient to document everything first. By Monday afternoon, the humiliation had already traveled through the building faster than the quarterly numbers Daniel spent the morning bragging about because corporate offices operate like high schools with better tailoring. And by 1:30 p.m., 3 different people had found reasons to stop by my desk without actually mentioning the meeting while I sat under the cold white lighting of operations row reviewing vendor contracts like my entire nervous system hadn't been peeled open in front of 50 employees only hours earlier. At 2:07 p.m. my inbox chimed with a calendar invitation titled Performance Alignment Discussion, scheduled by HR for Wednesday morning, which told me everything I needed to know because companies never use phrases like alignment unless they're preparing documentation. And when I opened the attached performance review draft, I noticed entire paragraphs criticizing communication tone, leadership warmth, and adaptability under pressure written in language almost identical to the rejected promotion assessment I'd privately appealed 6 months earlier after discovering Daniel had submitted executive feedback under supervisors who had never directly worked with me. I printed the document quietly, folded it into my notebook, and kept working because emotional reactions create witnesses while silence creates opportunities, and around 4:15 p.m. I finally opened the reimbursement audit Daniel had dumped on me Thursday night and started tracing approval signatures against archived payment logs from the company's Oracle accounting system. That was when patterns started appearing. A consulting vendor called Meridian Talent Solutions had received 6 separate emergency staffing disbursements, over 9 months totaling $486,000, yet internal staffing records showed only 2 contractors had ever actually entered the building under those authorization codes, and both contracts had ended months earlier. Even stranger, every approval came through Daniel's executive account minutes before end-of-quarter reporting deadlines. I cross-referenced expense receipts next, including a $12,840 executive dinner charged during a client acquisition summit in Miami on February 14, despite the supposed client company having no travel correspondence, no CRM notes, and no recorded partnership follow-up anywhere in our system. By 6:40 p.m. nearly everyone had left the office except custodial staff and the finance analyst team 2 rows over, and I remember sitting alone beneath the reflection of Chicago's skyline against the windows while slowly realizing Daniel's arrogance came from believing nobody below executive level could see the full operational picture the way I could. The next morning he acted like Monday never happened. He walked through operations, Rose smiling, carrying an espresso from the cafe downstairs, stopping briefly at my desk only to place another stack of revised staffing projections beside my keyboard and say, "Need these cleaned before Thursday's board prep?" In the same casual tone someone might use asking for copies at a printer, and for the first time in 4 years I looked directly at him without trying to appear agreeable. "Of course," I said calmly, which seemed to relax him instantly because men like Daniel mistake composure for obedience every single time. That afternoon I called an old colleague named Vanessa Ruiz who had transferred from internal compliance to a healthcare firm the previous year after filing 2 failed complaints against executive expense manipulation inside Halbrecht. And when I casually mentioned Meridian Talent Solutions, she went completely silent for nearly 5 seconds before asking, "Why are you looking at that vendor?" I told her I was reviewing audit discrepancies, and she quietly explained that Meridian had appeared in an internal compliance memo back in August 2024 tied to unverified staffing invoices, but the investigation disappeared after senior leadership intervened. Then she said something I couldn't stop thinking about afterward. "If Daniel's still using them, he thinks he's protected." I hung up, stared at the city lights outside my office window, and finally understood why he'd humiliated me publicly on Monday morning. Not because he thought I was weak, but because he was afraid someone had started noticing the numbers. Wednesday morning started with rain sliding down the glass exterior of the building in long gray streaks that made downtown Chicago look blurred and distant, and by the time I stepped out of the elevator at 8:03 a.m., HR had already converted conference room B into one of those fake comfort environments designed to soften professional damage with bottled water and sympathetic smiles. The performance alignment discussion lasted exactly 37 minutes, and almost every sentence felt rehearsed before I even entered the room because the HR director, Melissa Grant, avoided specifics while repeating phrases like concerns regarding executive compatibility and communication fit. Yet every example they cited came directly from projects that had increased client retention over the past year, including the Hartford Logistics recovery account Daniel nearly lost before I rebuilt the implementation timeline myself during a weekend emergency call in November. What fascinated me wasn't the criticism. It was how carefully they avoided discussing actual performance metrics. Daniel sat beside Melissa wearing a navy suit and silver cufflinks, nodding slowly whenever she spoke as though he were reluctantly disappointed in me instead of actively constructing the narrative, and at one point he even sighed before saying, "Nobody doubts your work ethic, Claire, but leadership is also about emotional flexibility," which almost made me laugh considering he once screamed at a finance assistant for misprinting presentation binders during a client summit in Dallas. I left the meeting with a formal development recommendation plan and a printed document requiring my signature by Friday, but the second I returned to my desk I scanned the paperwork directly into a private encrypted folder on my personal drive alongside screenshots of expense approvals, vendor invoices, Slack export logs, and executive authorization timestamps I'd quietly been collecting since Monday night. By then the story inside the numbers had become impossible to ignore. Meridian Talent Solutions wasn't just overbilling. It appeared connected to at least 3 ghost contractor allocations used to artificially inflate operational staffing expenses during budget forecasting periods, and the approval sequence suggested Daniel may have been using inflated departmental costs to justify executive restructuring bonuses tied to cost-saving recovery initiatives. In simpler terms, he created problems financially, then positioned himself as the executive fixing them. Around noon I scheduled a private meeting with Elliot Reeves from Internal Audit, using a neutral calendar title, Vendor Clarification Review, because openly escalating concerns inside Halbrecht before securing leverage would have been career suicide, especially against an executive already favored for promotion to regional director. Elliot arrived at 1:15 carrying a yellow legal pad and the exhausted expression of someone who had survived too many corporate disasters, And for the first 15 minutes I spoke carefully, showing only enough documentation to make him understand the risk without revealing the full scope of what I'd uncovered. The moment his eyes landed on the duplicated contractor payment IDs, his posture changed completely. "Where did you get these?" he asked quietly. "Company records," I replied. "The same ones nobody else cross-checked." He stopped speaking after that and spent nearly 10 minutes reviewing timestamps in silence before finally asking whether anyone else knew I had the files, and I remember answering, "Not yet," because by then instinct was telling me something bigger was happening behind the scenes. That instinct proved right later that evening when I received an accidental forward from Daniel's executive assistant, containing a partially attached board preparation memo discussing anticipated leadership transition announcements, scheduled for Friday morning. Daniel's name appeared twice in the document under projected promotions. Mine appeared once near the bottom under departmental restructuring impacts. I didn't need the missing attachment pages to understand what that meant. He planned to secure his promotion while removing me before the audit discrepancies surfaced publicly, and suddenly his behavior Monday morning made perfect sense because humiliation wasn't spontaneous. It was strategic positioning. He wanted the company to see me as emotional, difficult, and replaceable before anyone started asking why the woman managing operational reporting also happened to know where half the financial inconsistencies were buried. By Thursday morning, the atmosphere inside Halbrecht Consulting Group had shifted in a way people outside corporate environments rarely understand because offices become unnervingly quiet right before leadership crises surface, and I noticed it immediately when executives who normally ignored operations rows suddenly started walking faster, speaking softer, and closing conference room doors behind them. At 9:18 a.m., Elliot Reeves from Internal Audit called me from an internal extension and asked whether I could come downstairs without notifying your department head, which was the moment I realized the situation had escalated beyond a routine compliance concern. The audit room on the third floor smelled faintly like printer toner and burnt coffee, and when I entered, 2 additional people were seated beside Elliot, including an outside legal consultant named Rebecca Lynn, whose firm specialized in corporate liability investigations, which meant someone at board level had already become nervous enough to involve external counsel. Rebecca slid a printed spreadsheet across the table showing wire transfers connected to Meridian Talent Solutions alongside timestamps matching Daniel's executive approval credentials, then calmly asked me to explain how I first noticed the discrepancies, and for nearly an hour I walked them through everything chronologically. The reimbursement audit dumped on me Thursday night, the duplicated staffing invoices, the Miami client acquisition, expenses tied to non-existent accounts, the inflated labor forecasts used during restructuring presentations, and the HR performance narrative that appeared suspiciously timed right before executive promotion week. Nobody interrupted me once. At 11:02 a.m., Rebecca Nally leaned back in her chair and said, "Do you understand the exposure this creates for the company if these approvals were knowingly falsified?" And I remember answering very carefully because by then I understood survival inside corporations depends less on truth than on timing. "I understand why someone wanted me discredited before the board reviewed operational records," I said, and the silence afterward told me they had already reached similar conclusions themselves. When I returned upstairs around noon, Daniel was standing near my desk talking to Melissa from HR. And the second he saw me, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not fear exactly, but irritation, like someone noticing a problem they thought had already been handled. "Claire," he said smoothly, "I need the updated staffing projections before 4. I told him they were already in his inbox. He checked his phone immediately, probably expecting incomplete work or an emotional mistake, but instead he found perfectly formatted reports submitted 30 minutes earlier along with revised operational summaries that quietly highlighted undocumented contractor inconsistencies inside his division. He looked back at me for one long second without speaking. That afternoon, rumors started moving through the office in fragments. Someone from finance mentioned internal audit had accessed restricted executive records. A senior account manager whispered that Friday's board luncheon had suddenly been canceled. By 3:45 p.m. Daniel disappeared into a closed-door meeting with the CFO and 2 board members, while Melissa from HR stopped making eye contact with nearly everyone. I stayed at my desk calmly answering emails, reviewing vendor contracts, and documenting every interaction because emotional control had become my greatest advantage. While everyone else reacted to tension, I kept creating records. Around 6:20 p.m., long after most employees left, my phone buzzed with a private message from Elliot. Do not sign the HR performance plan tomorrow. 5 minutes later, another message arrived containing a scanned internal memo marked confidential board review with the subject line, Immediate Leadership Risk Assessment. Daniel's name appeared throughout the document alongside phrases like financial exposure, potential retaliation concerns, and executive misconduct liability. Near the bottom, one sentence stood out enough that I reread it 3 separate times sitting alone beneath the dim office lights. Interim Operational Leadership Recommendation, Claire Bennett pending final board approval. Outside the window, Chicago traffic glowed red beneath the rain-soaked streets while I stared at the screen, realizing the same people who watched me get humiliated 4 days earlier were about to witness something entirely different Monday morning. Friday began so quietly it almost felt unreal, and for the first hour the office moved with the tense politeness people use in hospitals before doctors deliver bad news, because by then everyone sensed something had happened overnight, even if nobody knew exactly what. When I arrived at 7:41 a.m., Daniel's assistant wasn't at her desk. 2 members of corporate legal were already inside the executive conference suite, and the security officer stationed near reception kept checking his phone every few minutes while pretending not to watch the elevators. I made coffee, answered 3 client emails, and reviewed vendor transition notes like it was a completely normal morning. Although my pulse didn't settle until 8:26 a.m. when Melissa from HR approached my desk looking visibly exhausted and asked if I could join the board upstairs for a brief operational discussion. The boardroom overlooked Lake Michigan through floor-to-ceiling windows, and the atmosphere inside felt cold enough to freeze conversation because 6 executives sat around the polished walnut table alongside Rebecca Lynn from External Counsel, Elliot Reeves from Internal Audit, and 2 board members who normally never attended operational reviews in person. Daniel was there too, except he no longer looked composed. His tie sat crooked beneath his collar, his jaw flexed constantly like he was grinding his teeth, and for the first time since I'd known him, he avoided looking directly at me. The board chair, Marian Keller, spoke first. Claire, thank you for your cooperation over the past 48 hours, she said before sliding a thick folder across the table containing printed audit summaries, vendor payment chains, reimbursement approvals, and internal correspondence connected to Meridian Talent Solutions. Then Rebecca calmly explained that preliminary findings suggested intentional financial manipulation tied to executive reporting structures under Daniel's supervision, including falsified staffing allocations and retaliatory HR documentation created after operational discrepancies became discoverable during audit review. Daniel tried interrupting twice. The first time Marian silenced him immediately. The second time Rebecca placed another document on the table, a time-stamped email recovered from executive archives showing Daniel instructing HR to begin performance correction documentation against me less than 2 hours after I received the reimbursement audit Thursday night the week before. The room went completely silent after that. I didn't speak once during the next 15 minutes while the board questioned him because I didn't need to anymore. The truth sounded stronger coming from official records than emotional confrontation ever could. By 9:14 a.m., Marian informed Daniel he was being placed on immediate administrative leave pending formal investigation and requested security escort him from the building after surrendering executive credentials. He looked at me exactly once while standing from the table, and what unsettled him most wasn't anger or triumph on my face. It was the complete absence of both. Calm terrifies people when they expected emotional collapse. After he left, the board discussed operational stabilization, vendor recovery exposure, and client risk mitigation before Marian finally turned toward me again. Effective immediately, she said. We'd like you to assume interim director responsibilities while we complete restructuring review. I thanked her, accepted the temporary contract packet, and signed the paperwork at 9:42 a.m. using the same black fountain pen Daniel had gifted department managers during Christmas bonuses 2 years earlier. By Monday morning, facilities had already updated executive parking assignments downstairs in the garage beneath the building, and when employees started arriving around 8 a.m., conversation stopped almost instantly because parked directly beside the executive elevator entrance where Daniel's reserved black plaque used to hang was a newly installed sign that read Claire Bennett, Interim Director Operations. I remember standing there for a moment holding coffee while people pretended not to stare, And honestly, the most satisfying part wasn't the promotion, the salary increase, or even watching executives suddenly speak to me with respect. It was realizing the same woman they tried to label replaceable had quietly become the person the entire company now depended on. 3 months later, the company finalized the investigation findings against Daniel Mercer and several senior approvals connected to the vendor fraud exposure. And although corporate statements used polished legal language like financial misconduct and leadership violations, everyone inside the building knew the real story had started long before the audit. It started the moment a man in power became arrogant enough to humiliate the person protecting his career behind the scenes. Sometimes I still think about that Monday morning meeting and the way 50 employees sat silently while he tried to reduce my entire career to the word replaceable. But the truth is, silence became my advantage because while he was busy performing authority, I was documenting reality. What changed my life wasn't revenge alone. It was finally understanding that calm people are often the most dangerous people in the room because they're usually thinking 3 moves ahead, while everyone else is reacting emotionally. The parking spot was never really about status. It was proof that patience, preparation, and self-control can quietly destroy people who mistake kindness for weakness. And if you've ever stayed silent while someone underestimated you, dismissed your work, or tried to make you feel invisible, subscribe. Because some stories deserve to be heard all the way to the end.